10 years ago, my brother vanished. Last night, his credit card was used to buy coffee 3 blocks from my house. On today's episode of The Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The humidity in Lagos usually feels like a wet blanket, but tonight, it felt like a shroud. Kosi sat in his darkened study, the only light coming from the amber glow of a half-empty glass of whiskey and the harsh, clinical blue of his smartphone. It was 11:47 p.m. when the vibration hummed against the mahogany desk, a sound that usually signaled a late-work email or a spam notification. But when he glanced down, the breath hitched in his throat, trapped behind a decade of scar tissue. It was a bank alert, a transaction notification for a platinum Visa card that should have been deactivated during the administration of a dead man's estate 10 years ago. The name on the account flickered in the dark. Ifani K. Okafor, his brother, the man who had walked out of a boardroom meeting in 2016 and vanished into the thick, equatorial air without leaving so much as a footprint. Kosi's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic, rhythmic thudding that drowned out the steady rainfall outside. The transaction was small, a mere 3,000 naira at a place called the Midnight Bean, a hole-in-the-wall cafe barely 3 blocks from where Kosi sat. It was an impossibility, a digital glitch from the afterlife, yet the cold logic of the banking server didn't deal in ghosts. It dealt in chips, pins, and physical presence. He didn't stop to grab a jacket. He ran to his car, his mind a chaotic kaleidoscope of Ifani's last day. The blue tie he'd worn, the way he'd forgotten his watch on the nightstand, the laugh that always sounded like rolling thunder. Driving through the rain-slicked streets of the island, Kosi felt the world blurring into a smear of neon lights and gray asphalt. He reached the cafe just as the open sign flickered off, the neon tube buzzing like a dying insect. The interior was dim, smelling of roasted Arabica and floor wax. The barista, a tired-looking youth with bleached hair, was wiping down the counter, oblivious to the fact that he had just served a phantom. Kosi's hands shook as he approached, his voice a gravelly whisper as he asked about the last customer. The boy shrugged, pointing to a crumpled receipt left on a corner table, half submerged in a ring of condensation from a cold condensation. Kosi picked it up with the reverence of a priest handling a relic. There, on the back, scrawled in the hurried, slanted cursive he would recognize in a blackout, were 6 words that turned his blood to ice. Meet me where we first kissed. It wasn't a message for a brother. It was a ghost reclaiming a memory that didn't belong to him. Kosi stood paralyzed in the center of the cafe, the scrap of thermal paper burning a hole in his palm. The phrase, "Meet me where we first kissed," was a serrated blade cutting through his psyche, but the edge was crooked. That sentence belonged to Kosi and Amara, the woman he was supposed to marry before the rain, and a faulty brake line took her from him in the same year he lost his brother. It was their private liturgy, a secret whispered in the quiet corners of the University of Lagos Botanical Gardens. To see it written in Ifani's handwriting was a cognitive dissonance, so violent it made the room tilt. He closed his eyes, trying to catch a lingering scent in the air, something that would anchor this nightmare to reality. And then he caught it, the faint, unmistakable trail of oud and bergamot. It was a heavy, masculine scent Ifani had obsessed over, but layered beneath it was something softer, the floral, powdery notes of hibiscus and vanilla. It was the exact blend Amara used to mix for herself. The air in the cafe grew heavy, the oxygen replaced by a thick, cloying sense of being watched from the shadows. He stepped back out into the rain, the droplets cold against his feverish skin. The wear was obvious, but the who was a jagged puzzle piece that refused to fit. If Ifani was alive, why surface now? And why use a phrase that was the cornerstone of Kosi's lost romance? He drove toward the gardens. The engines were a lonely sound in the sleeping city. His mind raced back to the accident, the mangled metal, the closed casket, the crushing finality of the dirt hitting the wood. He had buried her. He had seen the death certificate. Yet, the handwriting on the receipt wasn't a forgery. It had the specific way Efani looped his G's and crossed his T's, a detail no AI or identity thief could perfectly replicate with that level of casual fluidity. As he approached the old iron gates of the botanical gardens, now rusted and overgrown, he felt a sense of impending doom. He wasn't just looking for a brother anymore. He was hunting the foundation of his own grief. Every shadow cast by the towering Irako trees looked like a figure waiting to exhale a decade of lies. He parked the car, the headlights cutting a path through the mist, and realized that for 10 years he hadn't been living. He had been preserved in the amber of a tragedy that was starting to look like a masterpiece of theater. The University of Lagos Botanical Gardens at 2 in the morning was a cathedral of rot and old secrets. Kosi pushed through the rusted turnstile, the screech of metal sounding like a pained animal in the silence of the night. His flashlight beam cut through the encroaching ferns and the heavy, humid mist that clung to the bark of the ancient Irako trees. This was where he had proposed to Amara under a canopy of stars, a night flavored with the promise of a lifetime that never came. He moved toward the stone bench near the lily pond, the very spot where they had shared their first kiss as undergraduates. The stone was cool and slick with moss, but as he reached under the lip of the bench, a habit from their university days when they left notes for each other, his fingers brushed against something modern and jarringly real. It was a high-end, heavy-stock envelope, tucked into a plastic sleeve to protect it from the damp. His breath hitched as he pulled it out. Inside was no romantic sonnet. It was a printed Google Maps coordinate and a key with a fob for a luxury apartment complex in Eko Atlantic, the city's shimmering, reclaimed land fortress for the ultra-wealthy. The contrast was a physical blow. His brother had vanished from a world of mid-tier business struggles only to resurface in the most expensive zip code in the country. Kosi sat on the bench for a long moment, the weight of the key in his hand feeling heavier than the masonry of the gardens. He thought about the funeral he had held for Amara, the empty casket because the fire had been too intense for a viewing, a detail he had accepted in a state of catatonic grief. He thought about Efani's disappearance, which the police had lazily written off as a kidnapping gone wrong or a voluntary exit to escape mounting debts he hadn't known his brother had. Now, the coordinates pointed to a place where the sun never truly set and where the cameras were everywhere. The psychological toll of the realization began to manifest as a low-grade fever. Why lead him here? Why now, after a decade of silence that had nearly driven Kosi to the brink of his own erasure? He realized that the note wasn't just an invitation. It was a breadcrumb trail designed by someone who knew exactly how his mind worked, someone who knew that curiosity was the only thing stronger than his fear. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead, and began the long walk back to his car. The city of Lagos felt different now. Not a home, but a vast, intricate stage where the actors had been performing a play he wasn't allowed to see. Eko Atlantic rose from the Atlantic Ocean like a glass and steel middle finger to the chaos of the mainland. Kosi's old sedan felt like a relic as he passed through the multiple layers of security, the guards glancing at his rumpled clothes with suspicion until he flashed the high-security key fob. He found the building, a soaring monolith of white concrete and blue glass called the Azure. He didn't use the elevator immediately. Instead, he stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the 14th floor. The lights were on in 14B. He could see his silhouette through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a slender figure pacing back and forth. Even from this distance, the posture was devastatingly familiar. It was the way she held her elbows, the slight tilt of the head that suggested she was lost in thought or prayer. His heart did a slow, sickening roll in his chest. It couldn't be. Amara was buried in a cemetery in Enugu, her name carved in granite. Yet, as he watched, the figure stepped closer to the glass, the interior light illuminating a profile that had been burned into his retinas for a decade. The high cheekbones, the slope of the nose, the elegant curve of the neck. It was a ghost in a designer penthouse. The dissonance was so sharp it felt like a physical migraine. Kosi found himself moving toward the lobby in a trance, his thumb pressing the 14 button with a robotic precision. The elevator was silent, a vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of his lungs as the numbers climbed. He thought about the car accident again, the twisted metal of the Honda, the police report that spoke of a plunge into the lagoon, the closed casket service his mother had insisted upon to spare his soul the sight of the damage. Had it all been a choreographed exit? As the door slid open to a private foyer, the scent of oud and bergamot hit him again, stronger now, mixing with the salt air of the ocean. The hallway was lined with minimalist art, but Kosi saw none of it. His eyes were fixed on the heavy oak door of 14B. He didn't use the key. He stood there listening. From inside, he heard the faint, melodic sound of a woman crying. Not the loud, performative grief of a funeral, but the soft, rhythmic sobbing of someone who had been carrying a secret for far too long. It was a sound that broke the last of his composure, stripping away the shell of the man he had become and leaving only the grieving boy who had lost everything in a single, cursed year. Kosi's hand hovered over the door handle, the key fob trembling between his fingers. The lock was electronic, a soft blue ring that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. He felt like an intruder in his own life, a man stepping through a mirror into a world where gravity worked differently. When he finally pressed the fob to the sensor, the click of the deadbolt sounded like a gunshot in the sterile hallway. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges silent and well-oiled. The apartment was a masterpiece of quiet luxury, all cream silks, dark woods, and ambient lighting that made everything look expensive and untouchable. But the air was thick with the residue of a recent departure. A suitcase stood half-packed by the door, and the scent of the woman's perfume, Amara's perfume, was an invisible fog. He stepped into the foyer, his footsteps muffled by a hand-woven Persian rug. The sobbing he had heard from the hallway was louder now, coming from the sunken living room that overlooked the dark, churning Atlantic. He didn't call out. He couldn't. His throat was a desert, his tongue a dry leaf. He rounded the corner and saw her. She was sitting on the edge of a velvet sofa, her back to him, her head buried in her hands. She was wearing a silk robe the color of a bruised plum, and her hair, thick, dark, and coiled, was exactly as he remembered it on the morning of the accident. On the coffee table in front of her sat a single glass of red wine and a handwritten letter. The woman didn't notice him at first. She was too deep in her own cavern of sorrow. Kosi stood frozen, the reality of her physical presence shattering his remaining logic. This wasn't a hallucination. The way the light caught the fine hairs on her neck, the way her shoulders shook with each sob, this was a living, breathing person. He felt a surge of incandescent rage, followed immediately by a wave of paralyzing love. He wanted to scream her name, to demand how she could be alive while he spent 10 years visiting a piece of stone, but the words died in his chest. He was a man watching a miracle that felt like a crime. He took one more step, and the floorboards gave a faint, treacherous creak. The woman froze. The sobbing stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt underwater. She didn't turn around immediately. She went rigid, her fingers clenching the silk of her robe. Kosi watched as she slowly lowered her hands, her head still bowed. When she finally turned, it wasn't with fear, but with a weary, devastating recognition. Up close, the resemblance wasn't just striking, it was absolute. It was Amara. But it wasn't Amara who had aged 10 years in the shadows. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there before, and a hardness in her gaze that spoke of a life spent looking over her shoulder. She looked at Kosi as if he were the ghost, her breath hitching in a way that mimicked his own. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply looked at him with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. In her hand, she clutched a letter, the paper wrinkled and stained with tears. As she saw the key in his hand, a flicker of understanding crossed her face, followed by a shadow of guilt so dark it made Kosi flinch. "You weren't supposed to find this place yet," she whispered. Her voice was the final confirmation. It was that same low, husky alto that had whispered yes to him in the gardens a decade ago. It sent a shiver of pure electricity down his spine, a horrifying reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had been denied. Kosi found his voice, though it sounded like it belonged to a stranger. "I buried you," he rasped, the words feeling like shards of glass. "I stood at your grave every Sunday for 10 years. I spoke to a headstone. I cried until I had no tears left. How are you sitting here in a silk robe in Eko Atlantic?" He moved toward her, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He reached out and snatched the letter from her limp fingers. She didn't resist. She just watched him, her eyes brimming with a fresh wave of tears. The letter was addressed to "My dearest," and as Kosi's eyes scanned the first few lines, his world tilted again. The handwriting was unmistakably Afani's, but the words were those of a husband writing to a wife, apologizing for a necessary absence, and promising that their shared secret was almost at its end. Kosi stared at the paper until the words began to swim. He knew Afani's script better than his own, the aggressive slant, the way he never quite finished the tale of his whys. It was the handwriting of the man who had taught him how to tie a tie, how to drive, how to be a man. But the content was a map of a life Kosi didn't recognize. The letter spoke of the kids being safe at the summer house in Cape Town. It mentioned a transfer of assets that would ensure they never had to look back. It was filled with a domestic intimacy that made Kosi feel like a voyeur in a stranger's house. "Afani," Kosi breathed, the name tasting like ash. "He's been with you?" All this time, the woman who wore his fiancé's face, stood up slowly. She was taller than he remembered, or perhaps it was just the heels she wore, but she carried herself with a regal, guarded grace. She reached out as if to touch his arm, but pulled back at the last second, as if sensing the volatile energy radiating off him. "It's complicated, Kosi," she said, and the use of his name, the way she softened the O, nearly broke him. "There are things about your brother, about the business he was really in, that you were never meant to know. The accident, it was the only way out for both of us. If we hadn't died that year, we would have been killed for real, and they would have taken you with us." She spoke with a terrifying, calm logic, as if faking their deaths and leaving him to rot in a decade of grief was a mere administrative necessity. Kosi looked at the letter again, then at her. The kids, his brother and his fiancée, had children. They had built a family on the foundation of his trauma. He felt this sudden, violent urge to destroy the room, to rip the silk from the walls and smash the glass. Instead, he turned away from her, his eyes darting around the living room, searching for more evidence of this parallel reality. He was a man looking for the exit in a room that had no doors. He moved toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his sternum. The woman followed him, her silk robe rustling like dry leaves, calling his name in a tone that was half pleading, half warning. He ignored her. He pushed open the double doors to the master suite and stopped dead. The walls weren't decorated with abstract art here. They were covered in photographs. It was a gallery of a decade he had missed. There was Afani, looking older, his hair peppered with gray at the temples, laughing on a beach in Zanzibar. There was the woman, Amara, holding a toddler with Afani's eyes. There were Christmas mornings in rooms with fireplaces, birthday parties with bright balloons, and quiet moments of them sleeping on a veranda. In every single photo, they looked happy. They looked settled. They looked like people who had never spent a single night wondering if Kosi was okay. The betrayal was a physical weight, a pressure in his chest that made it hard to draw air. He walked up to a large, framed portrait above the bed. It was a wedding photo. The date at the bottom was etched in gold, November 12th, 2016. Kosi felt his knees buckle. November 12th was exactly 3 months after Amara's accident. While he had been sitting in a darkened room, staring at her photograph and contemplating ending his own life, she had been standing in a white dress, pledging her life to his brother. The cruelty of the timeline was breathtaking. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was a transition. They hadn't just left. They had traded him in for a better version of the same life. He looked at Afani's smiling face in the photo, the brother he had idolized, the man he had spent 10 years trying to find. The man was a stranger. The woman was a stranger. Even the room felt like a set designed to mock him. He reached out and touched the glass of the frame, his fingerprint leaving a smudge over Afani's heart. 10 years, Kosi whispered, the words a jagged edge. You let me mourn you for 3,650 days. The woman stepped into the room, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting long, distorted shadows across the gallery of photos. She stood a few feet away, her expression a mask of sorrow that Kosi no longer trusted. He turned to her, his eyes scanning her face with a clinical, almost obsessive intensity. He was looking for a flaw, a mole that wasn't there before, a slight difference in the iris, anything to prove that this was a twin, a clone, a cruel trick of the light. But the more he looked, the more the truth settled into his bones like lead. This was her. The way her left eyebrow arched slightly higher when she was anxious, the tiny scar on her chin from a childhood fall in Enugu, the specific way her pulse thrummed in the hollow of her throat. It was the woman he had loved, the woman he had promised to protect, now standing in the bedroom of the man who had been his blood. The psychological horror of the realization was worse than the grief had ever been. It was a total erasure of his past. Why him? Kosi asked, his voice dead and flat. Of all the people in the world to hide with, why my brother? The woman looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting a heavy gold wedding band that Kosi hadn't noticed before. Ifani was the only one who knew the danger, she said softly. When the threat started coming from his business partners, they didn't just target him. They targeted me to get to him. The accident. It wasn't just an escape, Kosi. It was a ransom. We had to disappear to keep the rest of the family, to keep you safe. If they thought we were dead, they'd stop looking. And they did. She looked up, her eyes pleading for a fragment of his understanding. Ifani saved me. And in the process, we found that we were the only two people in the world who understood what we had lost. It didn't start as a betrayal. It started as survival. Kosi let out a harsh, jagged laugh that sounded like a sob. Survival. They had survived on the marrow of his sanity. Kosi pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers flying across the screen as he pulled up the digital archives of his own life. He began to cross-reference the dates he knew by heart with the dates on the photos. The day he had collapsed at Ifani's memorial service, Ifani had been checking into a hotel in London under a false name. The day Kosi had sold his car to pay for Amara's funeral expenses, she had been buying a new wardrobe in Paris. The math of the betrayal was cold and perfect. Every time he had reached out to their mutual friends, every time he had sat with his mother and wept over the lost generation of their family, his brother and his fiancé were building a fortress of lies. He felt a sickening realization. His mother. Did she know? Had she been part of the theater? No. The stroke that had taken her 2 years ago had been brought on by the stress of her losses. They had killed her as surely as if they had pulled the trigger themselves. He turned back to the woman, his rage now a cold, crystalline thing. You killed our mother, he said, the words falling like stones. She died thinking she had no sons left, but a broken one. She died calling you names. The woman flinched as if he had struck her, her face going deathly pale. We couldn't tell her, Kosi. She couldn't keep a secret, not from you. If she knew, you would know. And if you knew, the people Ifani was running from would have found us. The logic was a circular cage. They had sacrificed their mother and Kosi's life to save their own, and they had dressed it up in the language of protection. Kosi felt a sudden, desperate need to see Ifani, to look into the eyes of the man who could calculate such a cost and decide it was worth it. He realized the note in the cafe hadn't been a slip-up, it had been a summons. Ifani was done hiding, or he was ready to move the chess pieces again. Restless and fueled by a manic energy, Kosi began to pace the apartment, opening drawers and closets with a frantic need to see how much of his own life had been stolen. He pulled open a heavy mahogany wardrobe in the dressing room and stopped. There, hanging among the expensive Italian suits and silk shirts, were items that made his breath stop. His old leather jacket, the one he thought he'd left in a taxi years ago. A set of gold cufflinks that had been their father's, which Kosi had reported stolen during a break-in at his apartment shortly after Ifani's disappearance. a collection of rare vinyl records he'd been searching for a decade. They hadn't just taken his brother and his love. They had been scavenging from his life, taking pieces of him to furnish their shadow existence. It was a level of voyeurism that felt predatory. They had been watching him, perhaps even entering his home while he slept, taking what they wanted to make their new life feel authentic. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. He reached into the back of the closet and pulled out a small, locked wooden box. He didn't need a key. He knew the trick to the latch, a secret Afani had shown him when they were children. He pressed the hidden spring, and the lid popped open. Inside was a collection of his own letters. Letters he had written to Amara after her death. Letters he had burned in a trash can in his backyard as a ritual of letting go. Or so he thought. They hadn't burned. Someone had fished them out of the ash, preserved them, and brought them here. He realized then that he wasn't just a victim. He was their entertainment. His grief had been the fuel for their romance. A tragic backstory they kept in a box to remind themselves of what they had escaped. The violation was total. He dropped the box, the letters scattering across the floor like dead leaves. And for the first time that night, Kosi felt a cold, sharp clarity. He wasn't here to reunite with his family. He was here to witness a crime. Kosi turned back to the living room, just as the heavy oak front door swung open. The sound of the ocean breeze rushed in for a brief second before the door clicked shut. Kosi stood his ground, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Footsteps echoed on the marble foyer, firm, confident, the footsteps of a man who owned the world. Then, Ifani stepped into the light. He was dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray suit, his face more lined than in the photos, but his eyes were the same, piercing, intelligent, and utterly devoid of the guilt Kosi expected to see. He didn't look surprised to see his brother standing in his living room. He looked like a man who had just finished a long day at the office and was ready for a drink. He walked to the bar, poured himself a finger of scotch, and then looked at Kosi with a faint, tragic smile. "I see you found the place," Ifani said, his voice as smooth as the whiskey. "Why?" Kosi asked, the word a ragged sob. "Why did you use the card? Why leave me here tonight?" Ifani took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving Kosi's. "Because the game is over, Kosi. The people we were running from. They're gone. The debt is settled. And I realized that I couldn't live another 10 years watching you through a telescope. I wanted to give you a choice." He moved closer, the scent of oud and bergamot now overpowering. He looked at the woman, Amara, and then back to Kosi. "You can walk out that door, and we will deposit $10 million into your account tomorrow morning. You can go back to your life, buy a new one, and forget tonight happened. Or you can stay. You can join us. But if you stay, the Kosi Okafor of the world knows has to die tonight, just like we did." He held out a second glass of whiskey, a peace offering that felt like a death warrant. Kosi looked at the glass, then at his brother, then at the woman who had been his heart. He realized then that the most terrifying thing wasn't that they were alive, it was that they expected him to thank them. The silence that followed Afani's ultimatum was heavy, tasting of expensive scotch and old blood. Kosi looked at the woman he had called Amara in his heart for a decade. But as she stepped toward Ifani, her posture shifted into something more domestic, more settled. Ifani reached out, his hand sliding familiarly around her waist, and she leaned into him with a sigh that sounded like a homecoming. "It's okay, Kayamika," Ifani whispered, the name hitting Kosi like a physical blow. Kayamika. It was a name from the same root as Amara, but it was different, fuller, older, and used only by those who knew her soul. When Kosi had known her, she was Amara, the bright, modern girl of the Lego social scene. Hearing his brother use a name of such intimate, traditional weight was the final confirmation that Kosi had never truly known the woman he intended to marry. She wasn't just hiding her location. She had been hiding her very identity from him even when they shared a bed. She whispered Ifani's name back to him, but it wasn't the Ifani Kosi knew. She called him Obi, a pet name rooted in heart, spoken with a rhythmic tenderness that suggested a lifetime of shared secrets and quiet nights. This linguistic betrayal was more painful than the physical one. In the Igbo culture of their parents, names were everything. They were the map of one's destiny. By choosing different names for each other, they hadn't just faked their deaths. They had performed a spiritual excision, cutting Kosi out of their new, sacred circle. Kosi realized that Amara and Ifani were the characters they played in his story, while Kayamika and Obi were the real people who had been thriving in the dark. He watched them, a cohesive unit of two, and felt the chilling realization that he was the only one in the room still tethered to a dead world. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and patience, as if he were a slow child failing to understand a simple lesson. The air in the room grew cold despite the tropical night, the salt from the Atlantic outside feeling like it was being rubbed into the open wounds of his memory. He wasn't just a brother or a fiancé anymore. He was a ghost haunting a house that had already been remodeled, driven by a desperate need for a weapon, or perhaps just a piece of the truth that hadn't been filtered through their lies. Kosi lunged toward a small, inlaid side table near the window. He began pulling out drawers, scattering silk coasters and gold-plated pens. Kayamika moved to stop him, but Ifani held up a hand, a mocking glint in his eyes. In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of international passports, Kosi found it. His breath hitched. It was a black, leather-bound book with a frayed spine. It was his diary, the one he had kept during the first 3 years of his mourning. He remembered the night he thought he had burned it in a fit of drunken despair, watching the pages curl in the flames behind his house in Acacia. But here it was cold and solid in his hands. He flipped it open to the middle. The pages were filled with his own handwriting, a record of his descent into madness, his suicidal thoughts, and his endless, agonizing prayers for their return. The horror of it was that the book wasn't just a relic, it was a manual. He realized they had been reading it. They hadn't just watched him from afar. They had studied his grief like a script. He saw notes in the margins in Ifani's slanted hand, observations on Kosi's stability, calculations on when it would be safe to move their assets based on how distracted Kosi was by his own sorrow. The diary he thought he had destroyed was the very thing they used to ensure their safety. Every time he had written about letting go, they had taken it as a green light to expand their shadow empire. The violation was so intimate it felt like a physical assault. They had lived inside his head, using his most vulnerable moments as a barometer for their own success. He looked at the book, then at the two of them, and for the first time, the grief was replaced by a pure, incandescent hatred. They hadn't just survived, they had fed on him. He was the host, and they were the parasites who had grown fat on his misery. Kosi clutched the diary to his chest, the edges of the leather biting into his skin. He felt a sudden, sharp memory of the accident scene, the smell of gasoline and the sound of the lagoon's dark water. He looked at Kayamika, really looked at her, and saw the faint, jagged line of scar behind her ear that he had never noticed before. It wasn't from a car crash. He remembered now, a night at a club in Victoria Island, weeks before she died, when she had tripped and fallen. He had been so worried, so protective. But now, the memory replayed with a different tint. He remembered Ifani standing in the background, his face a mask of calculated coldness. The sensory trigger wasn't the scar, though. It was the sound of a burner phone vibrating on the marble counter. It was a specific, high-pitched chirp, the same sound he had heard in the hallway of his own home a dozen times over the years, a sound he had always attributed to a neighbor or a glitch in the electronics. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. They had been inside his house. Not once, but frequently. That glitch in the security system he couldn't fix, the missing set of keys he thought he'd misplaced, the way the air sometimes smelled of oud and bergamot when he came home from work. They hadn't just read his diary. They had been his roommates in the shadows. They had stood over his bed while he slept, perhaps even touched his hair while he dreamed of their ghosts. The psychological cruelty of it was a masterpiece. They had used him as a human shield, knowing that as long as Kosi was mourning, no one would suspect they were still on the board. He was the decoy, the mourning brother whose public pain was the perfect camouflage for their private prosperity. Every tear he had shed was a brick in the wall of their fortress. He felt a sickening sense of vertigo, the room spinning as he realized the depth of the architecture they had built around his life. Ifani stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the Persian rug like a dark stain. "Don't look at me like that, Kosi," he said, his voice dropping into that deep, authoritative register that used to make Kosi feel safe. "I did what any leader would do. I protected the core. You were always the emotional one, the one who couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. If I had told you, you would have looked for us. You would have been followed. Your grief was the only thing that made our deaths believable. It was the ultimate insurance policy." He spoke of it with the cold detachment of a CEO discussing a necessary layoff. To Afani, Kosi wasn't a brother. He was an asset that needed to be managed, a variable that had to be controlled. The brotherhood he had cherished was a one-way street, a lie he had told himself to survive the loneliness. Kosi looked at the man who shared his DNA and saw a stranger. This was the dark side of the African big brother trope. The patriarch who believes his authority gives him the right to play God with the lives of those beneath him. Afani had decided that Kosi's happiness was a fair price to pay for his own survival. He had decided that Kayamika belonged to him, not because of love, but because of a shared sin. "You didn't protect me," Kosi said, his voice trembling with a new, dangerous strength. "You used me. You turned my life into a graveyard so you could live in a palace. You let me think I was the reason she died. You let me carry that guilt for 10 years. He moved toward the window, the diary still in his hand, looking down at the city of Lagos. He realized then that he had a power they hadn't accounted for. They needed his silence. They needed him to stay a ghost. The conversation shifted from the personal to the philosophical, a chilling debate held in the heart of a billion-dollar apartment. Kayamika spoke now, her voice devoid of the crying woman's fragility. She spoke of the system, the corrupt politicians, the oil cartels, and the invisible hands that move the money in Nigeria. She explained that Afani had stumbled into a web so vast that the only exit was the grave. "We didn't choose to hurt you, Kosi," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the dark sea met the dark sky. "We chose to survive the only way the world allowed us to. Is a decade of your grief worth more than our actual lives? Is your truth worth the blood of the children we've raised in the silence?" It was a classic moral trap, a manipulation designed to make Kosi feel selfish for his own pain. Kosi looked at her and saw the woman he had loved, but the image was flickering, replaced by the reality of the predator she had become. They were asking him to weigh his soul against their survival, a calculation they had already made on his behalf years ago. The moral cost of their safety was the total destruction of his youth, his peace, and his ability to trust. He thought about his mother again, the woman who had died with their names on her lips. "And what about Mama?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Was her death part of the survival too?" Afani didn't blink. "Mama was old, Kosi. She would have wanted us to live. She would have understood." The arrogance of the statement was the final straw. They had rewritten everyone's narrative to fit their own, turning even their mother's death into a footnote in their grand escape. Kosi looked back down at the diary in his hand, flipping to the final page. He noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small, blue ink stain on the bottom corner of the last entry. He remembered that stain. He had made it the night he burned the book, but he remembered something else now. He hadn't burned it in a trash can. He had thrown it into the fireplace in his study. The only person who could have retrieved it without the pages turning to ash was someone who was already in the room when he threw it. Someone who had reached into the flames before they could catch. A realization, colder and more terrifying than all the others, began to take shape. He looked at the woman, Amara, Kayamika, the ghost. "You were there," he whispered. "That night. I was so drunk I could barely stand. I thought I saw a shadow in the corner. I thought it was my mind breaking." Her silence was his answer. She had watched him try to destroy his pain, and she had reached in and saved the record of it, not out of love, but as a trophy. She had been the one who took it. She had been the one who watched him weep and decided he wasn't finished yet. The betrayal wasn't just a 10-year-old event. It was a continuous, daily act of surveillance. They hadn't just faked their deaths. They had lived a second life as the architects of his misery, ensuring he stayed exactly where they needed him. Afani walked to the wall and pressed a hidden panel. A safe clicked open, revealing stacks of US dollars and a series of clean, biometric passports. The boat leaves in 3 hours from the private jetty, Ifani said, his voice flat and businesslike. We are moving to our final location. We are leaving the country for good this time. No more watching, no more shadows. You have 2 choices, Kosi. You take the money, you burn that diary, and you go back to your life. You tell the world you found nothing. You live as a rich man, and you never speak our names again. Or he paused, his eyes turning stone cold. You try to be the hero. You call the police, you try to stop us, and you find out just how deep our reach goes. But remember, if we go down, the story we tell will involve you. We'll make sure you look like the accomplice. We'll make sure you lose everything you have left. It was a final, brutal enclosure. They were offering him a bribe wrapped in a threat. Kosi looked at the money, enough to buy a new life, a new name, a new history. He looked at Kayamika, who was already starting to pack the last of the suitcases, her movements efficient and cold. He was a man standing at a crossroads in a world that had already been paved over by his own brother. The city of Lagos hummed outside, indifferent to the 3 ghosts in the penthouse. Kosi felt the weight of the diary in his hand, the only piece of truth in a room full of expensive lies. He realized that if he took the money, he would be finishing the job they started. He would be killing himself. Kosi didn't take the whiskey. He didn't take the money. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked toward the door. Keep your money, Ifani, he said, his voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. And keep your names. You think you've built a fortress, but you've just built a smaller cage. You're going to spend the rest of your lives wondering if I'm the one who finally speaks. You're going to look at every shadow, every vibration on a phone, and wonder if it's me. He opened the heavy oak door, the cool air of the hallway rushing in. He looked back one last time. They weren't the powerful masterminds he had feared moments ago. They were just 2 people trapped in a high-rise, terrified of the light. He walked out of the azure, past the security guards and the neon lights, and drove back to the mainland. He didn't go home. He went to the botanical gardens. The rain had stopped, and the air was sweet with the scent of damp earth. He sat on the stone bench where he had found the key and opened his diary to the first page. He took a lighter from his pocket and watched as the flame caught the corner of the leather. This time, he didn't throw it in a fireplace. He held it, watching the words, his pain, their manual, turn into gray ash and drift away into the Lagos night. As the last page vanished, Kosi felt the weight of 10 years lift from his shoulders. They were alive, but to him, they were finally dead. He stood up and walked away, a man who had finally learned that the only way to beat a ghost is to stop believing in it. The architecture of silence was broken, and for the first time in a decade, Kosi breathed in the air of a world that was entirely his own. They offered me $10 million to stay a ghost in their machine, but some secrets are too expensive to keep. If you found out your 10 years of grief were just a cover story for someone else's paradise, would you take the money or burn it all down? Let's talk in the comments.